At Glasswater Estate summer gala, billionaire Orson Vale raised his glass before 200 guests and declared his son would marry rich, a strategic alliance to protect the Vale empire. Then, Nolan Vale stood up, pointed toward the open terrace where a woman in a plain cotton dress stood holding a little girl's hand and said quietly, "I choose Tessa, the single mom next door." The room went dead silent. Orson's face turned to stone. 1 year later, that single choice would bring the most powerful man in Baymere Harbor to his knees. If you're new here, stories like this one are what we do. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Orson Vale did not build his empire by being sentimental. He had grown up with nothing, a father who drank, a mother who worked double shifts at a cannery, and a childhood bedroom that smelled like salt water and mildew because the roof leaked every winter. He remembered what it felt like to wear shoes with holes in them to school. He remembered the particular shame of it. And he had spent the next 40 years making sure he would never feel that way again. By the time he was 61, Orson owned Vale Coast Properties, a company that controlled the most desirable stretch of coastline in Baymere Harbor. Resort chains, private marina slips, luxury villa developments. His name was on buildings, on donor walls, on the short list of people the mayor called before making decisions that affected the waterfront. He was not simply wealthy. He was the kind of wealthy that reshaped geography. But wealth in Orson's philosophy was not something you built alone. It was something you protected through the right partnerships, the right alliances, and above all, the right marriages. He had married strategically himself decades ago, and while the marriage had not been warm, it had been useful. His wife had brought connections. He had brought ambition. Together, they had produced one son. That son was Nolan Vale. At 34, Nolan had his father's sharpness and none of his coldness. He could read a contract in 20 minutes and find the clause that would sink you. He could walk into a room full of hostile investors and leave with 3 of them on his side. He was, by every professional measure, exactly the heir Orson had designed him to be. What Orson had not designed and could not account for was the part of Nolan that had started to suffocate. It had been building for years. The back-to-back board meetings, the dinners where every conversation was a transaction. The way his father looked at people not as human beings, but as variables, useful or not useful, an asset or a liability. Nolan had spent his entire adult life inside that equation, and somewhere around his 33rd birthday, he had started to feel like one of its variables himself. So that summer, instead of staying at Glasswater Estate, his father's glass and steel showpiece on the hill, with its climate-controlled rooms and its view of the harbor that felt more like surveillance than scenery, Nolan rented a small wood-frame house on Juniper Lane. Juniper Lane was everything Glasswater Estate was not. It was a narrow residential street 3 blocks from the public beach, lined with older homes that had been painted and repainted so many times the layers had started to tell their own history. Kids rode bikes in the early morning before the heat settled in. Neighbors waved at each other across yards. Someone on the corner made lemonade and sold it from a folding table with a handwritten sign that said, 50 cents, honor system. The street smelled like sunscreen and cut grass and the occasional backyard barbecue. Nolan arrived with 2 suitcases and a coffee maker and stood on the front porch of his rental for a long moment, listening to the sound of children playing somewhere nearby, and felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in months. He noticed the woman next door almost immediately. Not because she was trying to be noticed, but because she was impossible to miss. She was in constant motion, loading a folding table into the back of an aging Subaru, stringing a piece of rope between 2 trees to dry beach towels, crouching down in the front yard to examine something her daughter had found in the grass. Her expression as serious and attentive as if the child had handed her a rare artifact. Her name was Tessa Rowe. Tessa was 31 and worked as a program coordinator for the Baymere Harbor Community Center, running summer activities for kids whose families couldn't afford day camps or recreational programs. She had done the job for 4 years and was good at it in the way that people are good at things they genuinely believe in, not performing competence, but actually possessing it. She was raising her daughter alone. The girl's name was Lumi. She was 6 years old, and she had her mother's directness and none of her caution. Within 20 minutes of Nolan's arrival, Lumi had appeared at the low fence that separated their yards, studied him with open curiosity, and handed him a piece of watermelon through the gap, without introduction or explanation. "You looked hot," she said, as if that settled the matter, and walked back inside. Tessa, watching from the porch, called after her, "Lumi, you can't just—" Then she looked at Nolan, and something like an apology crossed her face, followed quickly by something closer to amusement. "Sorry, she doesn't really have a filter yet." "It's the best watermelon I've ever had," Nolan said, and meant it. Tessa had no idea who he was. He was wearing a linen shirt that cost more than her monthly car payment, but she assumed he was some kind of mid-level professional on a summer rental, the type who discovered Juniper Lane on a real estate app and thought it looked charming. She did not think he would last past Labor Day. She was wrong about that. But she wouldn't find out how wrong for several weeks yet. The heat wave arrived on a Tuesday and didn't apologize for it. By mid-morning, the temperature had climbed past 94 degrees, and by noon, the power had gone out across the lower half of Juniper Lane. A grid failure, the utility company's automated message said, "Estimated restoration time unknown," which in practical terms meant no fans, no refrigeration, no relief. For the residents of Glasswater Estate, a power outage was an inconvenience. For the residents of Juniper Lane, it was a crisis. Mrs. Calloway, in the yellow house at the end of the block, was 78 and asthmatic. The Reyes family next to her had 4 children under the age of 10. The elderly man everyone called Mr. Pete, nobody seemed to know his last name, sat on his front steps in the full sun because his apartment faced west and had become, by early afternoon, functionally uninhabitable. Tessa saw all of this before 9 o'clock in the morning. By 9:15, she had dragged 2 folding tables into her backyard, filled every cooler she owned with ice, and was on the phone with the community center, arranging an emergency supply run. By 10, she had a rotation going, lemonade and cold water at the tables, wet cloths in a bowl of ice water for anyone who needed to cool down, peanut butter sandwiches and fruit for the kids who had nowhere to go and nothing to eat now that the refrigerators had gone dark. Nolan stood at his kitchen window and watched. He had grown up watching his father command rooms, board meetings, press events, charity galas, where the donations were as much about visibility as generosity. He knew what performed leadership looked like. This was not that. Tessa wasn't performing anything. She was just moving, steadily and without drama, from one problem to the next, in the particular way of someone who has learned that emergencies don't wait for you to feel ready. She had Lumi with her the entire time. The girl was too young to carry coolers, but she had appointed herself the official greeter, standing at the gate of the backyard with a cup of lemonade, ready for anyone who came through. When Mr. Pete shuffled in, looking gray and overheated, Lumi guided him to the best chair, the one in the shade, with the focused authority of a child who had decided this was her responsibility. Nolan went outside. He told himself he was just going to ask if she needed help. He was not prepared for Lumi to turn around, look at him with complete practicality and say, "You're tall. Can you carry the big cooler from the porch? Mom can't lift it by herself." There was no question in it, no please, though her mother would later remind her about that. Just the simple logic of a child who saw a problem, identified a solution, and applied it. Nolan carried the cooler, And then he carried 3 more. He made 2 runs to the gas station 4 blocks away for extra bags of ice, paid for them without mentioning it, and came back to find Tessa reorganizing the supply table, with the focused efficiency of someone running a field operation on 0 sleep. She glanced at the ice, then at him, and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Really looked the way people do when they're recalibrating, and then handed him a cup of lemonade and went back to work. They worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon. He followed her lead, did what she asked, didn't try to take over or offer money or suggest that someone else should be handling this. At one point, she was on the phone with a city councilman's office, calmly and precisely explaining why the grid failure in this section of the neighborhood needed to be prioritized. And Nolan listened to the way she spoke. No anger, no pleading, just facts, delivered with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was entitled to ask for, and felt something shift in him. He had sat across from CEOs, senators, and investors worth 9 figures. He had never felt as aware of another person's quality as he did watching Tessa Rowe manage a neighborhood emergency from a backyard with 2 folding tables and a cooler full of ice. When the power finally came back on at 6:40 in the evening, the street let out a collective sound, half cheer, half exhale. Lumi threw her arms up. Mr. Pete patted Tessa's hand and said, "You're a good girl," in the way that old men say things they mean deeply but can't quite say directly. Tessa laughed, tired and sun-flushed, and looked over at Nolan. "Same time tomorrow if it goes out again," she said. "I'll bring the ice," he said. She smiled, just barely. But it was real. Orson Vale did not leave things to chance. When his assistant flagged that Nolan had been spending significant time at a residential address on Juniper Lane, not just weekends, but weekdays evenings, multiple weeks in a row, Orson did what he always did with information that concerned him. He had someone look into it. The report came back within 48 hours. Tessa Rowe, 31, Community Center Coordinator. Annual income that wouldn't cover the catering bill at a Vale Coast Properties quarterly dinner. Single mother. The father of her child, a man named Bram Keaton, had left when the girl was 18 months old and had not been meaningfully present since. No family wealth, no industry connections, no assets beyond a used car, and a rental history that showed she had never missed a payment, which Orson noted briefly before setting it aside as irrelevant. He read the report twice. Then he picked up the phone and told his event coordinator to make sure Nolan was seated at the main table at the Glasswater Estate summer gala. The gala was the social event of the Baymere Harbor season. 200 guests, a catered dinner on the estate's ocean-facing terrace, and the kind of ambient wealth that expressed itself through understatement. No one wore their most expensive thing. That was the point. Celeste Marlowe arrived with her parents at 8. She was 29, polished, and genuinely pleasant in the way of someone who had been raised to be pleasant in rooms like this one. Her family's investment firm was in late-stage negotiations with Vale Coast Properties on the Azure Dune Resort development, a deal worth enough that Orson had been thinking about it in terms of legacy rather than profit. A marriage between the families would not just close the deal, it would lock it in for a generation. Orson had not told Nolan any of this in advance. He preferred to present things as already decided. He waited until the dinner plates had been cleared and the room was at its most relaxed. Champagne in hand, guards down, before he stood and called for attention. His remarks were brief and practiced. He spoke about the Vale family's history in Baymere Harbor, about the next phase of development, about the importance of building the right partnerships. And then he turned to Nolan and said with the calm certainty of a man who had never seriously considered being contradicted, "The strongest foundations are built between strong families. Nolan, the Marlowes have been generous partners. I think it's time we made that partnership permanent." The room understood. Celeste's mother smiled. Someone near the back began to applaud. Nolan did not move. For a moment the room held its breath, reading him the stillness, the expression that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't compliance either. Then he set his glass down on the table, stood slowly, and looked at his father with something that might have been sadness if it hadn't also been so completely resolved. "I appreciate what you've built, Dad," he said, "and I understand what you're asking." He paused. Then he walked toward the open terrace doors. Tessa was standing just outside. She had come at Nolan's quiet invitation, uncomfortable in her plain cotton dress among the linens and silks, holding Lumi's hand, because the babysitter had canceled and she hadn't wanted to leave her daughter home alone. She had been about to suggest they leave. She had no idea what had just happened inside. Nolan stepped through the doors, stood beside her, and took her hand. Then he turned back to face the room, his father, the guests, the Marlows, the 200 people his father had assembled as an audience for a decision that was never supposed to be Nolan's to make, and said, "I choose the person who makes me want to be better than I was yesterday. I choose Tessa." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Nolan had ever heard. Orson's face did not crumble. It set hardened into something cold and final, the expression of a man who has just reclassified a situation from negotiable to resolved. When he spoke, his voice was level, which made it worse. "Then you choose it without the company, without the accounts, without the Vale name behind you." "I know," Nolan said. He didn't let go of Tessa's hand. Lumi looked up at her mother, then at Nolan, then back at the room full of silent, staring people, and whispered, "Are we in trouble?" Nolan looked down at her. "No," he said quietly. "We're fine." It was the first time he had said "we." Losing the Vale name turned out to be louder than Nolan had expected, not in the way of dramatic confrontations or public humiliation. Orson was too controlled for that. It was quieter. The access codes to the company accounts stopped working on a Monday morning. His corporate card declined at a gas station that same afternoon. The assistant who had managed his calendar for 3 years stopped returning his calls. Not out of cruelty, Nolan suspected, but because she had been told to. Within a week, the infrastructure of his professional life had been efficiently and completely dismantled, the way a construction crew removes scaffolding once a building no longer needs it. What cushioned the fall barely was a personal savings account Nolan had maintained quietly for years, separate from the Vale family accounts, funded from his own salary rather than the family trust. It had been instinct more than planning, the financial equivalent of keeping a go-bag by the door. It covered rent and basic expenses, but it was a different kind of money than he was used to. Money you had to think about. Money that required decisions. He bought store-brand coffee, for the first time in his adult life, and stood in the kitchen drinking it, trying to decide if it tasted worse, or if he had just decided it should. It tasted fine. The house needed work. The back porch had a soft spot in the floorboards near the railing. The ceiling fan in the bedroom wobbled badly enough to keep him awake. The kitchen faucet dripped. Nolan, who had spent his career managing multi-million-dollar development projects, discovered that he had absolutely no practical knowledge of how to fix any of these things. He watched tutorial videos on his phone while crouching on the porch with a hardware store bag and a look of focused uncertainty that Lumi found deeply entertaining. "You're doing it wrong," she told him from the fence one afternoon. "I know," he said. "Do you know how to do it right?" She considered this seriously. "No, but I could watch and tell you when it looks worse." He laughed genuinely without thinking about it and handed her a juice box from the cooler beside him. Deal. It was like that with Lumi. Uncomplicated. She had accepted his presence with the same straightforward logic she applied to everything. He was there. He was useful sometimes. He made her mother laugh occasionally. And he knew a lot of facts about fish, which she found impressive. She didn't ask about his family, or his money, or why he'd moved to Juniper Lane. She asked if he wanted to help name the hermit crab she'd found at the beach, and when he suggested Gerald, she agreed immediately, and with great seriousness. Tessa was more careful. She was kind. She had always been kind. It seemed to be structural rather than performed, but there was a measured quality to her warmth now, a door that was open only so far. She would talk to him across the fence in the evenings. She let him help carry supplies to the community center on Saturdays. She included him in the loose, informal rhythms of the street, the block's impromptu backyard gatherings, the Friday night porch conversations that started at 7 and ended whenever the mosquitoes got bad enough. But she didn't let him in past a certain point, and he understood why, without needing to ask. He had learned her history in pieces, the way you learn things about people in neighborhoods like this one, through casual mentions, through things Lumi said without realizing they carried weight. Bram Keaton had left when Lumi was a year and a half old, walking away from his daughter with the casual finality of someone who had decided the role didn't suit him. Tessa had reorganized her entire life around Lumi without complaint, but also without pretending the reorganization had been easy. The self-sufficiency she carried was not a personality trait, but a survival skill, the kind you develop when you've learned that depending on someone is a risk with real consequences. She had looked at Nolan at the gala and seen a man willing to make a grand gesture. Grand gestures, in her experience, were the easiest part. They required one moment of courage. What came after required everything else. One evening, sitting on her porch after Lumi had gone to bed, she said it plainly. I've seen men decide they want something simpler. They come here. They like the quiet. They like feeling like a regular person for a while. And then August ends, and they remember who they are. Nolan was quiet for a moment. You think that's what I'm doing? I think you don't know yet, she said. And I think that's honest of you. But I have a 6-year-old who already calls you by your name instead of the neighbor. And that means I have to be careful in ways you don't have to be. He didn't argue with her. He didn't offer reassurances or promises. He just nodded slowly and said, That's fair. It was, she would think later, exactly the right thing to say. Not, I'll prove it to you. Not, you're wrong about me. Just, that's fair. By mid-July, Nolan had become a fixture on Juniper Lane, in the way that only happens when a place has genuinely accepted you. He helped Mrs. Calloway drag her recycling bins to the curb every Wednesday because her hip had been bad since spring. He showed up at the community center on Saturday mornings to load and unload supply boxes. He learned which kids in the neighborhood were allergic to what, because Tessa kept a mental list, and he had started keeping one too. He fixed the wobbling ceiling fan eventually, after 4 tutorial videos, and 1 call to a hardware store employee named Dale, who had the patience of a saint. With Tessa, things had shifted. Not dramatically. She didn't do things dramatically, but perceptibly. She laughed more easily around him. She asked his opinion on real things, not conversational filler. One evening, she sat across from him at her kitchen table with a stack of program budget sheets and said, without preamble, "Tell me where I'm losing money." He spent 2 hours going through her numbers, finding 3 places where vendor contracts could be renegotiated. And she had listened carefully, taken notes, and said at the end, "You're actually useful." "High praise," he said. "Highest I've got," she said, and smiled at her budget sheet. And he thought, I would give up considerably more than a company for this. He had not told her who he was. Not in the way of active deception. He hadn't invented a story or claimed a different profession. He had simply never corrected her assumption that he was a mid-level business professional on extended leave. He told himself it was because he wanted to be known as himself, not as the Vale name. He told himself she would understand when he explained it. He told himself there would be a right moment. There wasn't a right moment. There was just a Tuesday afternoon when Tessa came home from the community center, set her bag on the porch table, and placed her phone face up in front of him, without a word. The screen showed an article from the Baymere Harbor Gazette, 3 years old. The headline read, "Vale Coast Properties breaks ground on Harborside Terrace, displacing 40 families in lowest income coastal district." Below the headline was a photo of the groundbreaking ceremony. Orson Vale stood at the center, shovel in hand. Beside him, in a dark suit, expression polished and unreadable, stood Nolan. Tessa sat down across from him and waited. Nolan looked at the photo for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was level, controlled, which was worse somehow than anger. "I wanted you to know me before you knew the name." "I understand that," she said. "And I also need you to understand that while you were deciding when to tell me, I was making decisions. About trust. About what I let Lumi see." She paused. "She drew you a picture, Nolan. She put it on your door. You know what that means for a kid who watched her father leave without looking back." He did know. That was the thing that landed hardest. Not the exposure of his identity, but the weight of what Lumi had already extended toward him. The way children extend trust before they have the language to know that's what they're doing. "I know," he said quietly. "So tell me honestly." Her eyes were steady on his. "Are you here because you want this life? Or are you here because you needed somewhere to not be Orson Vale's son for a while? Because if it's the second one, I need to know now. Not for me. I can handle being wrong about someone, but I cannot let my daughter." Her voice caught just slightly, and she steadied it. "I cannot let her get more attached to someone who's going to decide come September that he misses his real life." The question sat between them, occupying all the air on the porch. Nolan didn't reach for reassurance or deflection. He thought about it, actually thought about it, and then said, "I hid who I was because I was afraid if you knew, you wouldn't give me a chance to show you who I wanted to be. That was wrong. I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning." He paused. "I'm not going back to that life, Tessa. Not because I burned the bridge, because I don't want it anymore. But I understand if that's not enough right now." She didn't respond. She picked up her phone, went inside, and closed the screen door quietly behind her. It was not a slam. It was worse, the sound of someone who was hurt enough to need to be alone, but measured enough not to make it a scene. Tessa did not shut him out completely. But she rebuilt the distance, and Nolan did not push against it. He kept carrying supply boxes on Saturdays. He kept waving to Mrs. Calloway. He kept being present without demanding anything in return for it. It was Lumi who broke the silence between them without knowing that was what she was doing. One evening, about a week after the porch conversation, Nolan was sitting on his front steps in the cooling dark when he heard the fence gate click. Lumi appeared, still in her pajamas, holding a folded piece of paper with both hands, like it was something official. She held it out to him without explanation. He unfolded it. It was a drawing crayon on notebook paper, the figures slightly lopsided in the way of children's art, but unmistakably intentional. 3 people standing under a tree, a small figure in the middle with yellow hair, a taller figure on either side. Below it, in careful oversized letters, "You said today you are here." "Lumi," he said carefully. Does your mom know you're out here? She's on the phone, Lumi said with the confidence of someone who had identified a workable gap in supervision. Are you going to go away? Nolan folded the drawing along its original crease. I'm not planning to, he said, but I can't promise things I don't control. What I can tell you is that I'm here tonight, and I'll be here tomorrow. Lumi considered this with the gravity of a small person weighing a significant decision. Then she nodded once, as if accepting terms, and went back through the gate. Nolan went inside and taped the drawing to the kitchen wall. Tessa had been standing at the screen door during the last part of that conversation. She had heard every word. She didn't say anything that night, but something in her that had been held tightly began very slowly to release. 3 days later, the letters arrived on Juniper Lane. Formal correspondence from Vale Coast Properties addressed to each homeowner and tenant individually, outlining the company's interest in acquiring the full stretch of Juniper Lane for the Azure Dune Resort expansion. The language was careful. Words like fair market offer and voluntary participation and community enhancement. But the subtext was clear. Sell, or find yourself surrounded by a construction project that would make staying untenable. The street responded the way close communities respond to external pressure, with collective alarm and a kitchen table meeting at the Reyes house that lasted until 11 at night. Tessa showed up with a notepad and left with 4 pages of notes and a mandate to figure out what their actual options were. She came to Nolan the next morning. Not softly, she walked across the yard and said without preamble, I need to know what's in these contracts, what they can actually do versus what they're implying they can do. She handed him a folder. He opened it. He read through the documents carefully, looking not for what was stated, but for what was structured, the scaffolding beneath the language that revealed actual intent. It took him an hour. When he looked up, Tessa was sitting across the table, watching him. There are 3 clauses in here that are deliberately ambiguous, he said. They're written to sound like protections for residents, but they're actually worded to give Vale Coast the right to reclassify the entire acquisition as eminent domain adjacent if the voluntary sale rate doesn't hit 70%. That language is buried in Section 4. It's not in the resident summaries. Tessa's jaw tightened. Can we fight it? Yes, but you need to move fast. Get the community organized, document everything, and build a formal opposition case before they hit their threshold. He paused. I can help. Not with money, I mean. I can walk residents through what they're signing, identify pressure points, help you build a documented record. Over the next 2 weeks, that was exactly what they did. Nolan sat at kitchen tables across Juniper Lane, going through contracts line by line with homeowners and tenants who had never had anyone explain to them what they were actually being asked to sign. He translated legal language into plain sentences. He helped Tessa compile the documentation into a coherent case file, the kind of organized, sourced, structured argument that was difficult to dismiss. It was the most useful he had felt in years. Not because it was impressive work, but because it mattered to specific people in a specific place, and he could see that directly. She watched him do it, and she knew, not from what he said, but from the way he showed up day after day without being asked, that she had her answer to the question she had asked on the porch. She came to him one morning before he left for the community center, just walked across the yard and said, I've been waiting for you to prove something. And I realize that's not fair, because you've been proving it every day, and I've been moving the goalposts. She met his eyes. I don't want to keep doing that. I'm scared, Nolan. But I'm more scared of standing here on the safe side of the fence and watching you go. It was not a grand gesture. It was better than that. It was a woman who had learned the hard way that trust was a risk choosing to take it anyway. Not because the fear had gone away, but because she had decided he was worth it. The Baymere Sun Festival ran the last weekend of July. 3 days of outdoor concerts, food vendors, craft markets, and a waterfront parade that drew crowds from 3 counties. The harbor lit up at night with string lights and boat lanterns. The whole thing had the quality of a place performing its own happiness for an audience, which was exactly what Orson Vale had been counting on. The Azure Dune Resort announcement had been scheduled for the festival's main stage on Saturday afternoon. Orson had chosen the timing deliberately. Maximum visibility, maximum goodwill. The optics of a beloved local billionaire investing in the city's future framed against the backdrop of its most celebratory weekend. He had arranged press coverage, a remarks program, and a reception afterward for investors and city officials. It was designed to be, in Orson's phrase, a done deal dressed up as a celebration. What he had not arranged for was Tessa. She arrived at the waterfront plaza 40 minutes before the announcement, with 11 Juniper Lane residents and a 3-inch binder of documentation that Nolan had helped compile over the previous 2 weeks. The residents spread out quietly, each carrying printed copies, the contract analysis, a timeline of previous Vale Coast displacement projects, and a 1-page, plain-language summary that anyone could read in under 2 minutes. They did not shout. They did not block the entrance. They stood in a visible line near the stage and handed their materials to anyone who would take them, which turned out to be quite a few people once the press noticed what was being distributed. Nolan had not planned to go on stage. He had positioned himself at the edge of the plaza, watching. He had told himself his role was the documentation, the preparation, the behind-the-scenes work. But he watched his father take the podium, watched the assembled press, watched Tessa standing straight-backed and steady with her neighbors, and understood with a clarity that felt physical that staying at the edge was not neutrality. It was a choice, and it was the wrong one. He walked to the stage. The security detail recognized him and hesitated, just long enough for him to step up beside his father at the podium. Orson turned. For one moment in front of the cameras, it was just the two of them, father and son, looking at each other across a distance that had been building for years and had finally run out of room to hide. "The documents being distributed right now are accurate," Nolan said into the microphone. His voice was steady. "The Section 4 clause in the acquisition contracts gives Vale Coast Properties the right to pursue eminent domain-adjacent reclassification if voluntary sale thresholds aren't met. That language was not disclosed in the resident summaries. The families on Juniper Lane did not know what they were being asked to sign." The plaza went very quiet. Reporters called out questions. Camera flashes went off in rapid sequence. Orson stepped forward. His voice, when he found it, was the voice Nolan had grown up fearing: low, contained, and absolute. "You are done," he said. Not a threat, a pronouncement. "You are not a Vale. You are not my heir. You are not affiliated with this company in any capacity from this moment forward. That is final." "I know," Nolan said. He stepped off the stage. Tessa was waiting at the bottom of the steps. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully name. Not gratitude, not relief. Something more complicated and more serious than either. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," he said. She didn't argue, but he could see the weight settling into her face, the awareness that he had just lost everything, publicly and permanently, and that her name had been standing at the center of it. Lumi appeared from the crowd and took both their hands, simultaneously, one in each of hers, with the matter-of-fact grip of a child who had decided this was simply how things were arranged. Neither of them moved away. But standing there in the cooling evening, Nolan felt the full weight of what had just happened settle into his chest. No father, no company, no name, no certainty. Just a woman who had chosen him back, and a 6-year-old holding his hand, and the distant sound of festival music playing for a city that had no idea what had just changed. August settled over Baymere Harbor like a held breath. The festival crowds thinned. The days stayed hot, but the light changed. Less aggressive, more slanted. The particular quality of late summer sun that reminds you the season is running out. On Juniper Lane, the usual rhythms continued, but there was something underneath it all that hadn't been there before. A waiting quality. Nolan moved through the days quietly. He had not heard from his father since the festival. He had not expected to. What he spent energy on instead was harder and more immediate, figuring out who he was without the structural identity he had inhabited for 34 years. Not the money, that was practical manageable, but the name, the position, the automatic authority that had walked into every room ahead of him his entire adult life. Without it, he was just a man in a wood-frame house on a residential street, with a kitchen wall that had a child's drawing taped to it. He found on the harder mornings that he wasn't entirely sure that was enough, and the uncertainty itself disturbed him, because he had chosen this loudly and publicly, and the idea that he might have chosen wrong was not something he had given himself permission to consider. Orson, meanwhile, was not handling stillness well. In the 2 weeks following the festival, he had managed the professional fallout with practiced efficiency. Investor calls, a revised project timeline, a press statement that reframed the Azure Dune announcement as a consultation process rather than a done deal. The Marlowe family had been the hardest conversation. Celeste's father had been genuinely angry, and the investment negotiations had been suspended indefinitely. Orson had spent 3 difficult calls walking that back, from a complete collapse to a cautious pause. It had cost him, in the particular currency of relationships built on expectation. But the mess he couldn't manage was the one he hadn't identified as a mess until it was too late. His assistant placed a printout on his desk one morning, a photo from the festival pulled from a local news site. In it, Nolan was stepping off the stage. In the foreground, slightly out of focus, Tessa stood with Lumi beside her, the girl's hand raised toward Nolan as he came down the steps. The caption read, "Vale heir walks away from family empire for a single mother and her daughter." Orson looked at the photo for a long time. He had seen Nolan make presentations to hostile investor groups. He had seen him negotiate, perform, execute every variety of professional competence at close range. He had never seen his son's face look the way it looked in that photo. Not composed, not strategic, not performing anything at all, just present, certain in a way that had nothing to do with outcome. He drove to Juniper Lane on a Thursday afternoon without calling ahead. He parked at the end of the street and walked. He had not walked a residential street like this in a very long time. Not since he was a boy, in a different kind of neighborhood, before he had decided that neighborhoods like this were something to escape from, rather than something to protect. He found Nolan at the community center 3 blocks down, helping set up a portable canopy frame for an afternoon program. Tessa was beside him, reading something off a clipboard. Lumi was nearby, organizing small chairs into a circle with the solemn precision of someone who had been given an important job. Orson stood at the chain-link fence and watched. No cameras, no staff, no curated presentation. Just a man setting up canopy poles in the August heat, because the children who were about to arrive needed shade. Tessa said something. Nolan laughed the real laugh, the one Orson barely recognized because he had so rarely been the cause of it. Lumi looked up and saw Orson at the fence. She stared at him for a moment with the unsettling directness of young children, then walked over and said through the chain link, Are you here for the program? It starts at 3. Orson looked at his granddaughter. The word arrived in his mind without announcement, simply the accurate word for what she was, and said quietly, I think I might be a little late for that. That's okay, Lumi said seriously. Mom says better late than never. Orson came back the next morning. He came alone on foot. He walked the 3 blocks to the Baymere Harbor Community Center and stood at the front door for a moment before going in. Tessa was at her desk when he appeared in the doorway. Her expression did not change in any way that suggested surprise, as if she had been expecting this or something like it, and had already decided how she would handle it. Mr. Vale, she said. Ms. Rowe, he said. I was hoping you had a few minutes. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. He sat. He noticed in the way you notice things when you're paying real attention for the first time that the community center was full of evidence of sustained effort, hand-lettered program schedules on the bulletin board, a shelf of donated books organized by reading level, a whiteboard covered in a summer activity calendar that had been revised and revised again until it was nearly illegible. The kind of place that runs on less money than it needs and more commitment than is reasonable. He had been prepared to write a check to make this conversation easier. He had left the checkbook in the car. I owe you an apology, he said. Tessa folded her hands on the desk. She did not say, it's fine, or don't worry about it, the reflexive softeners that would have let him off the hook. She just waited. I looked at you and I saw a liability, he said. A complication. I ran a background check on you like you were a contract risk, and I used what I found to try to move you out of my son's life. I didn't see a person. I saw a variable. He paused. That was wrong. Not just strategically, morally wrong. It was, Tessa said. Her voice was even. Not forgiving, not hostile, just honest. And I want you to understand something. You didn't just insult me. When you looked at me and decided I wasn't worth your son's time, you made a judgment about every woman raising a child alone who has ever sat across from someone like you. About what we're worth, about what we're capable of, about whether we count. She held his gaze. I need you to understand that before anything else. Orson was quiet for a long moment. I understand it, he said. I'm not sure I deserve to be believed when I say that, but I understand it. It was not the response of a man performing contrition. It was the response of a man who had arrived at an uncomfortable truth through a long route and was sitting with it without trying to manage his way out of it. She didn't forgive him that morning. She told him so plainly. But she listened, and she let him stay long enough to say what he had come to say. What followed was not a dramatic reversal. It was a series of decisions made carefully and in the right order. Orson withdrew the original Azure Dune acquisition proposal. He brought in an independent mediator to work with the Juniper Lane residents directly, with full transparency on all contract terms. The Marlowe family, after 2 further conversations, agreed to remain as investors on the revised project, reduced in scope, longer in timeline, but still viable. It was less than what Orson had originally built, and it was the right version of it. The redesigned development plan, redrawn over 6 weeks with genuine community input, kept the residential street intact. The resort project was built around the existing neighborhood, rather than in place of it. A renovated community center, a public pool, a weekend farmers market on the vacant lot at the end of the block, and a small branch library in the space where the old laundromat had stood. The community center renovation was funded through Vale Coast Properties. At Tessa's insistence, the building was named by the residents themselves. They named it Lumi House. Nolan did not return to Vale Coast Properties as heir or executive. He came back as a consultant on the community development project. A defined scope, a real seat at the table, and the condition that residents had meaningful input at every stage. It was less than what he had been. It was more than enough. The wedding was in the backyard, on the last Saturday of September when the heat had finally broken, and the light had gone gold and horizontal, the way it does at the end of summer, when the season is letting go gracefully. There were 40 people, folding chairs on the grass, string lights in the trees, a table of food that the neighbors had assembled collectively, each bringing something, the whole of it adding up to more than the sum of its parts, in the way that community things do. Lumi walked down the improvised aisle first, carrying a bunch of sunflowers in both arms, too large a bunch for her size, which she managed with great dignity. She had been practicing. When she reached the front and took her place beside her mother, she looked at Nolan with the expression she reserved for things she had decided about permanently, and said, at a volume the first 3 rows could clearly hear, "Hi, Dad." Nolan's composure lasted approximately 2 seconds after that. Orson in the front row did not look like a man who had built an empire. He looked like a man who had been given something he hadn't known to ask, for a seat at a table he hadn't built, among people who had not been required to include him, and had chosen to anyway. When someone beside him asked quietly what he thought of his son's choice, Orson watched Tessa take Nolan's hands at the front of the yard, watched Lumi standing between them with her sunflowers, and said, "I told my son to marry rich. I didn't understand that there are kinds of wealth I never learned how to measure. Tessa is the richest person I have ever met, in courage, in character, in the way she loves the people who belong to her. My son didn't marry down. He married further up than I knew how to see." The backyard was quiet for a moment after that. Then Lumi, who had been listening with great attention, nodded once and said, "Yeah." And that, in the end, was the final word. Some choices look like losses until enough time has passed to see what they were really building. Nolan Vale walked away from a name and found a life. Tessa Rowe let someone past the fence she had built to stay safe and found it had been worth the risk. And Orson Vale, who had spent 40 years believing that value was something you could count, learned it from a 6-year-old with a handful of sunflowers who had known the whole time. If this story stayed with you, the real ones usually do. Subscribe so you're here for the next one. And if you know someone who needs to hear that being chosen by the right person matters more than being impressive to the wrong ones, share this with them. We'll see you in the next story.